I'm Richard Keating. I'm the Managing Design Principal for Architecture for Jacobs. And we're at the last of the events, the last 3 days. And so we think this is going to be relaxed, as you can see by the way we're seated, and philosophical by the questions that we're going to be discussing. And our subject, as you can see from the slide there, is that what are the primary opportunities and barriers to sustainability in tall buildings? I think this conversation has been going on from one session to the next, and now it's time to kind of bring it to the fore and perhaps truly engage you as we go into these conversations. I do want to introduce Mehdi Jalayarian, who's to my immediate right from Chicago. He's the Executive Vice President from EDS, Environmental Design Inc. Bob Pratt, Managing Director of Tishman Speyer here in Shanghai, and David Scott, the Structural Director of Lang O'Rourke in London. I think that those names and businesses, of course, are probably familiar to you, so it's a matter of having some expertise to be engaged in some of this conversation we're going to bring about sustainability and where we're going with all the things that we've enjoyed in this conference. So with that, I'll move the slides forward just a bit to touch on a few things that I had noticed that I thought we should think in the back of our minds and have come up many times. In terms of the opportunities, the global urbanization is actually the word that was attached to the Council on Tall Buildings in probably 1975 or 80. And it was, of course, urban habitat. An odd word, habitat. It sounds a little different than urbanization might today, but nevertheless, underlying a lot of what we're talking about in these tall buildings is, in fact, the forces of urbanization. So there's quite a lot of forethought in the naming of the council right at that moment. And perhaps the things that I've been hearing during these sessions are, we've done so much dialogue and conversation about the entity of the particular tall building, but many people seem to be wanting to talk about the reasons underlying those tall buildings and how they come together. So perhaps urbanization is truly the right word there. One of the primary opportunities we've all spoken about in terms of the densification of our cities is the actual underlying genetic code created by the transit that allows that. And the mixed use, the shift that you've seen in the slides from pure office towers to housing, hotel, and office mixed together is really one of the primary reasons that we see opportunities for these types of buildings. Some of the barriers are the costs. We've talked some about that, but the cost is either a cost question about the building as an entity or the building as one of a group of buildings in a region. I think you'll hear our group speak directly to that issue as well. And to my sensibilities, we're on a verge of new kinds of materials which will generate a new kind of architecture. We've obviously, from the swimming cube and slightly before, we know what the ETFEs of the world have done to architecture, and I think we're going to see new structural materials and new enclosure systems quite soon. Well, that will change a lot of how we think about these types of buildings. But with that in mind, Mehdi, would you like to touch on a few things?
Yes. The opportunities for sustainability in tall buildings is really unlimited if you want to be innovative and we wanted to extend it to the next level. However, I wanted to just outline some of the high-level big items that are applicable to tall buildings. One of the opportunities, obviously, the first one in my mind is the massing and configuration and orientation of the building. If those are thought about it at the beginning of the project, I think there's a large step that can be taken to get to sustainability. Here is an example of Kingdom Tower by virtue of its plan being a triangular shape. It's really a southern exposure plus the east and west that are folded back to become northeast and northwest. Therefore, by virtue of its design, it has efficiencies that are built into the shape. So a lot of these are very important steps at the very beginning of the project to think about. Obviously, for tall buildings, climate has advantages and disadvantages that you can take care of from. Wind is very important. Most of you are familiar with the wind design of the tall buildings. As the elevations increase, the wind velocities also increase. That offers several opportunities. You can locate the louvers in the building in a way that that take advantage of the winds. The pressures on the outside could be anywhere from negative 150 Pascal to perhaps 300-400 Pascal positive. So all those points can be taken into account to reduce the fan energy that it requires to draw air in and exhaust out. Little things like that that can add energy and benefit. We all know that with the tall buildings, the temperature also reduces. This building, the difference between the base of it to the top is more than 5 degrees centigrade. If you translate that to effect of the temperature outside to this building, at the top of the building, you actually have about 20 to 30% less load that's imposed to the ventilation system, just purely from a temperature standpoint, and there are other things that goes with it. Air is drier up there and many other things. The big area that I think is important, we're going to talk about it today a little bit more, is the system of standardization. With the buildings like this, where you have a lot of equipment that are installed within the building, anything that you can standardize and normalize around the size, production, it brings not only sustainability for the building itself from a development, from procurement standpoint, but it also makes it simpler to manufacture, to ship, troubleshoot. There's many advantages that goes with that. System efficiencies are well talked about in the industry. Small or big building, they have the same advantages. One big item that's related to tall buildings is zoning. We need to pump the building up to elevations. Every time you make a transfer through a heat exchanger, you lose some temperature, you lose some effectiveness. This particular building has 2 primary zones. We're actually exceeding the limits of the manufacturer item to the utmost possible. I think next taller building than this would have to really expand the technology on the heat exchanger design. The industry has to really start from maybe industrial side and move into more of a commercial application to be able to install those capabilities. And then because of the use and the large population that's in these buildings, water efficiency is very, very important aspect throughout. So these are some of the opportunities that I've outlined here. As far as barriers, we always know that construction cost is one of the barriers, so you can't really, the sky is not a limit for sustainability. We need to, at some point in time, come down to the ground and understand that financially the project has to be viable. So we need to optimize that to what they get from the benefit that they receive from, be it on the envelope side, be it on the system side, on the overall shape and configuration. Constructability is very important. We all have seen designs around the world that are difficult to construct. So the simpler you make them, obviously they become more efficient from a cost standpoint and easier to construct. And also, over the life of the project, there's a whole new step in sustainability, the operations. These buildings are going to be built for the next 100 years. You don't build them for today. They need to ultimately operate and operate efficiently for the life of it, and be able to adapt to growth and modifications that are required for, be it industry that changes from a technology standpoint that needs to be implemented for the tenants, or the need of the building needs to be updated to reposition it for other occupancies. So flexibility and those kind of things are important. Another point I want to make on the barriers is really, most of these tall buildings are iconic buildings. So we all need to work together to kind of find a balance between the iconic design as well as the sustainability. The two kind of clash with one another at some point in time. And then the clients and a tenant that are going to occupy these buildings have to also show interest. We need to engage them in the process and make them understand, and for us to also understand their side from the operations and the use, so we can adopt the designs to those specific requirements. One area that I think is a barrier for all of us is industry feedback. Unfortunately, tall buildings are kind of canned society. They're not really published as much. This is a great organization for it to get the information out, but there aren't really that much feedback from industry and from actual installed buildings. I haven't seen a lot of publications that says, okay, this building, 100-story, used this much energy last year. We need to be able to have that feedback, not only from a design standpoint, but also from an operations standpoint, to help all of us grow and understand and be able to formulate better solutions for them. With that, I think you're next.
Thanks, Mehdi. So as a landlord, I think I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and both of the opportunities I'm going to talk about are related to our customers, our tenants. And the first area is tenant behavior. One of the things that we know about our buildings, because we are not only developers, we're operators of real estate. So our operating platform is very much about property management and building operations. And what we've seen in terms of tenant behavior is that if you give them a tool that helps them understand how they're living in a building, big changes can happen. And we're not the only landlords that are doing this. I think if you look at the major landlords in New York and across the US, and I'm sure there's examples in Europe and Australia and other places, there's an increasing dependence on feedback and measuring, as Mehdi said. The ability to gather information and then to find ways to use it is a tool that can be used to influence behavior, and that behavior can very often lead to significant energy savings. So one of the very easy things that we're doing in our buildings, we're both in existing buildings and new buildings, putting pulse meters in on the tenant side, so that the tenant, once they're hooked up to that system and then tied into a web-based application, they can see in pretty much real time what's going on in their space. And if that leads to measures where they're doing things with controlling their lighting or campaign to get everybody to turn off their computers when they go home, there's a number of different things that actually provide real and tangible benefits. So that's one area. I think related to tenant behavior, there's a whole issue of the use of existing buildings. I know there was a discussion that was given by Adrian and Gordon Gill's office, I think last year at Seoul, where they had done an analysis of existing building stock in Chicago and proved that I think one of the great opportunities we have as professionals is not in the one or two projects we get involved with of new build. Yes, it's significant what we're doing, and we're oftentimes showcasing new technology, but the existing building stock that's out there is a huge opportunity in terms of improving kind of our footprint in how energy is used in buildings. Another area that I'll talk about is tenant requirements, and this is where I'd probably want to also enlist the aid of the brokerage community in helping us talk about how tenants use buildings. Too often there is almost an arms race mentality as you describe a building, a Class A building. Oh, we need 60 watts a square meter on the power side, or else it's not Class A. I think we want to try to start to educate tenants into asking, well, how little energy can a building use? How little can we actually get by with in terms of our plug load and our lighting load, but still have a great workspace? I think that's something that it's a big opportunity that if, as a group, including our tenants, our customers, if we can focus on it, there's a way that we can drive efficiencies into our design. Some barriers, and again, as oftentimes the leaders of the development process, we often see barriers come up in the collaboration, and it's the wider collaboration that you get involved with as you move through a new development. We see barriers that are from utilities. We see barriers that exist from certain bureaucratic offices. So you've got to get the mindset of the whole group that's involved in the building process to participate in sustainability as a goal. If the utility isn't interested in looking at a trigen or a cogen facility because they've got certain rules that have existed for 50 years, it's a problem. There's certain, there's certain things that are able to be done in other parts of the world that are commonplace and we know make sense, but just aren't allowed. So I think that's a real barrier that we've run across. Similarly, embedded rules within building codes, within legislation, there are all sorts of hidden landmines that if you're not aware of them and you run across them, all of a sudden it's a surprise. Assumptions you're making about trying to push the envelope on things, you find out it's not allowed by the rules, and you may run across a code official that is not going to give you much leeway on it. So it's a couple thoughts from my perspective. I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Rob. I'm David Scott. I'm a contractor. I used to be a consultant until about 6 months ago. And I was asked to identify some of the key points like the rest of us, and not surprisingly, I'm going to repeat and reiterate what these guys are saying here, where I think that the key issues are. And coming to an event like this, it's a great opportunity to actually hear some really thoughtful and detailed discussion about some aspects of this. Because we all have our prejudices, and to some extent we all feel it's a bit too difficult to do anything. I just came from the discussion in this room about urban planning and the sky bridges, and there was some really good discussion about the pros and the cons of doing that in terms of how they really operate and what you're creating in terms of letting the population use buildings in the way that perhaps you don't really want them to be used. And some of these details and issues are very complex. So my list of opportunities starts with mass transit and creating sustainable cities. And coming from Hong Kong, it's got a great buzz to it. I don't know anyone that doesn't really like it. I lived there for 15 years. It's got a great city feel to it. And I then wonder, well, and people love being close to the MTR. And I then went to New York after Hong Kong, and people don't really want to be close to the MTR. There isn't the building and recognition that being able to get around the city at any time is a really good and effective way of living. And I'm not sure, I think the Shanghai mass transit system, if you haven't gone on it, take it, it's fantastic. It's thousands of people coming in and out every minute, and the city is really connected. And I think that the post-industrial cities are a way to go to make use and develop mass transit systems. And we need to understand why or how we can operate them better in places like London, Sydney, etc. Interconnectivity of buildings, both in planning and link bridges, but also in services, CHP systems that can take waste heat from one building and put it into another building. And somebody told me the idea of the guy with the swimming pool wondering how to heat his pool when it's sitting on top of an office that are just dumping their heat into the air. It's these obvious connections that we're not very good at seeing and understanding. But I think the main challenge, the only way we'll actually change the building systems is if developers are competing on a performance basis as well as a looks basis. Because all the performers claim their buildings behave the best, and the lack of data really stops us achieving that. And I think when we get more and more data, we will, the industry will change, because clients will become informed, tenants will want to say, I'm only going to go into a high performance building. So I think IT systems, Rob mentioned it, but people will be able to see their buildings on their iPhones or whatever comes after the iPhone, and be able to understand their effect on the planet, and particularly young people wanting to understand what they're doing. I also think that there are great alternatives to glass. And glass walls everywhere, in my view, are not the way to go. Again, the Wuha project I thought was wonderful in Singapore. And it's not just because I'm a contractor and we do lots of precast beautiful walls, but it is a bias. Modular construction, I think, is a big deal because it gives you the opportunity to optimize designs. And Lang O'Rourke have been building plant rooms around the world for years, and we looked at 100 of them, and we reckon that we could get 80% of them could be covered by 3 standard products. And we're now developing these standard products, and we believe that both in terms of money, but in the ability to optimize design, if you've got a product, then I think that you'll get much larger performance. But you'll also have a benchmark in which you can understand the data that's coming out of these systems. So this is the first virtual mock-up of one of our plant rooms where we expect to go into production in May, and this will be a self-assembly system that will be giving us data on all the buildings that we install them into. So it will be pre-tested, it will be pre-assembled, delivered to site, connected together. So that covers pre-fabrication. So it gives you the opportunity for optimization, the opportunity to collect data, be able to phone up clients and say, I think you need to look at this part of the building because it doesn't appear to be operating properly. And you can do that both as part of the management system, but also remotely if you wanted to. What are the barriers? Well, it's the greenwash and the ability for everybody to claim everything without really substantiating it. And it's in a data-rich society, sometimes it's just too much data. It's difficult to actually find out really what's really going on and how things are operating. And it's a very complex subject because the lowest energy performing building is the empty one. And one of the highest performing buildings is the one that's operating 24 hours. But I think that if somehow the utility companies were forced to put into the public domain the data use of the resources that are taken up by the buildings, then consultants would be able to make claims and draw conclusions about how their buildings were performing relative to others. And they would advise the tenants that this is a high-performing building, and the owners would be wanting to change their buildings to be in that upper barrier, the upper bracket. So things like the Neighbours system in Australia, I think, is probably one of the most effective ones, where you have to supply the energy use data, and people are then able to look and see how their buildings compare. And you're able then to tune your building against a fairly sort of level playing field. So the lack of standards is probably also it's the lack of understanding about how you can actually correlate a performance to a usage, to a building type. And with mixed-use buildings, it gets even more difficult. So it's that ability to how do we actually get into the details. Particularly, I've got an interest about how we assess the sustainability of icons, because I believe icons are really have a great benefit to society. I think Dubai, nobody can imagine it now without the Burj Khalifa. And it's building the city, and the city is building around it. But if you step back and look at, and that's important, but if you think about how is that building operating, well, first of all, none of us here, except perhaps a few people that are involved with it, know what the usage is, what the energy use is, or even how much it vibrates. And all of that is really important to understanding the sustainability of it. And of course, it's going to be really unsustainable. Lots of the apartments are owned by millionaires who go there once a month, or let their kids use it at weekends or something like that. And but it has a place in society, and these very tall buildings do. But I think that if we could get more data, then it would be interesting to know what we're doing and how really sustainable these buildings are.
Any of you had any further thoughts along the way since before we open up to questions?
I guess one comment, I'll make a little plug for our ex-head of sustainability, Riggs Kubiak, who started a website in the US called Honest Buildings that is really attempting to collect data on buildings in a transparent way. And if you have the chance, you should probably go and look at it. I know Riggs has got great ambition in terms of how far he can push that. And he's certainly, because he's had great response in a very short time, landlords are getting interested in getting that data out there. Because I think David's exactly right. Once we all start to have measuring sticks and we can start to honestly compare how buildings perform, it's going to teach us all a lot about where we need to go next to solve problems.
I was thinking that the very act of building one of these things is so unusual compared to the norm of average buildings. The investment, the energy, the scale and things. We haven't torn one down yet, not one icon that I can think of, starting from Stonehenge, and so they will have other lives at some point in time. I have this imagination that's a little weird, but you can imagine after global warming, these are still sticking up out of the ocean someplace, and they could be attractive. But I think that the whole way of coming back and revisiting these great efforts we're making to create these things and find other uses for them in the future will be an inherent sustainability question as well. So with that, perhaps we can engage you all. I know, John, you had a question you wanted to bring up, but we'll let you think about it, or you want to raise it now? Okay. There's one over here.
Thanks. Name's Roger Frechette. David, you mentioned the Burj Khalifa project, and my question is, if you could imagine that building was very efficient, perhaps even a zero energy building, the impact on the city of Dubai would really, from an energy standpoint, would almost be negligible because it's one building of thousands and thousands. But these tall buildings, they are really unifying forces. They are iconic and they're designed to be inspirational. How important is it for us to make these investments, to make these tall buildings very sustainable, if for no other reason than to really send that message and try to inspire all the other buildings to do the same?
I think that you've summarized it very well. It is that they are important in the creation of cities. And I think that the sustainable goals that you should try and achieve are the demonstrations that we've got multiple systems that make use of, that minimize the use of resources, as well as minimizing materials and maximizing life. One of the presentations yesterday talked about designing for duration. These tall buildings are going to be around for hundreds of years. It's the design, 50-year design life makes no sense whatsoever. 200 or longer is probably what you ought to be trying to target. So I do think they're unlikely to be sustainable in their own right. They are going to be the place to go, so they need to attract money to make them be built in the first place. And they attract value on all the buildings around them. But I do think they also need to be demonstration projects. And I think it would help in some way if we understood how sustainable or how much energy they used per head of population per occupation to decide if there are other ways of achieving icons without, spending hundreds of millions of tons of carbon on an edifice for society. So I think globally, we don't want to get to a position where in 20 years we are just criticized, or 30, 40 years criticized by the young people for building something in such a wasteful way. John's got a big smile on his face because he understands that argument completely. It is an issue. We've got to be responsible. And if we can collect data, then we'll understand the responsibility. But it needs the big building owners to come clean a bit and talk about how effective, what they're doing, and how much energy they're using.
I think another thing that could be added there is that tall buildings inherently are a centerpiece of a development. So their sustainability cannot really just measured by that single building alone. Although we all try to do that, but you need to look at it holistically. So Burj Khalifa is a good example. It created an environment, a mixed-use sort of urban center around it that ultimately is going to save a lot of energy overall from a transportation standpoint, from access standpoint, from a multiplicity of the occupation that's right there in the center. The building itself may not fully be compatible to a very sustainable from an energy standpoint, but I think it creates an environment that ultimately becomes that.
Said differently, if you didn't do it and you let the city sprawl,
yes,
you could see the differences right there.
Correct.
The discussion in the session before this talked about urban density. Dubai is a very low urban density, and seeing the Burj Khalifa in close proximity to 5-story buildings is very, to me, it's a bit disturbing. It's like, well, why is that? Now, it's been a while since I've been there, so they're probably 50-story buildings now, but it has a very low urban density, and there's many ways that you could achieve a similar sort of urban density.
Lester Partridge from AECOM. David, you mentioned about the neighbours system in Australia, which I actually use quite a bit and find it to be a fantastic system as a leveller of buildings of different sizes and in different climates and in different systems to compare against each other and their performance, and actually allows you as a design tool to design your building to achieve a certain performance, commit to that, and then 18 months later take the readings from the electricity and gas meter and be able to normalise those numbers back to get a rating. And it's interesting to see how, regardless of the size of the buildings, more often than not, they can achieve fairly similar ratings depending on how well their systems are designed, taking into account vacancy rates and all that through the year as well, which it does do. One of the things that the Australian government has done now, which is taking it to the next level, is to say that all building owners, every time that they are about to make a transaction as a sale of a building or taking on board a tenant, a new tenant, that they have to, by law, disclose the rating of their building. So we call it mandatory disclosure. So it's now advertised on a building that is about to be leased that this building is a 0-star rating or this building is a 5-star rating. I'd just like to know what your comments are to mandatory disclosure for buildings, and maybe Robert yourself as a building owner, what you would think if you had a portfolio of buildings and 10% of them were 0 stars, but you still had to advertise that. Is that something you would promote, or would you?
Les, I think we're actually comfortable with that. We view ourselves as a pretty responsible landlord, and we make big efforts. We've kind of systematically worked through our portfolio globally focused on improving performance. And why are we doing that? Yeah, certainly it helps us with our utility bills, but it also helps our tenants with their utility bills. And it's good for all of us. So I don't think we would really have much of a dispute on that, because if we go into a transaction, if we're looking at a building, we've got enough smarts in our due diligence process. We can discern pretty rapidly whether it's the equivalent of a 0-star or a 3-star building. Anyways, it's part of our kind of our DNA about how we think about buildings. We look at it very much from an operational point of view. So I think that sort of mandatory disclosure is probably a really, really useful trend, because it separates out a certain class of landlord from other landlords who maybe aren't that interested in that. So we'd support it.
I think that kind of disclosure also brings education to the tenants that are using it. So over time, if they're in tune with what the buildings are actually consuming, what's happening on an ongoing basis, be it at the beginning of the lease process or even ongoing, they're going to become a better user of that building over the life of it. So I think it's a win-win for both sides.
I'm interested, does anyone here not support mandatory disclosure of resources used by buildings? And if not, what is the argument against it? Because I don't understand why we as an organization would not be very strong advocates, because it's one of the only ways that we can change the industry.
Are you against it?
Uh-oh. There's trouble.
Well, you know, Anthony Wood, CTBUH, I agree with what you're saying, but I think there are intricacies here that we perhaps don't appreciate, and so the kind of, I had an interesting conversation a few months ago with Rick Cook of Bank of America, and David, you'll remember Bank of America won the CTBUH Best Tall Building Award 2-3 years ago. And Rick Cook and his client from Bank of America came up to Chicago and presented on this building. We were all really impressed at the Bank of America's commitment to not only energy monitoring in the building, but true post-occupancy analysis, really trying to get an understanding in data of that holy grail of impact on productivity. Because that's the part of, and I came in a little bit late, so you may have discussed this, but actually, the next appreciation of sustainability, in my view, which is even greater than the energy saving, is the impact on the positivity of the environment, yeah, and the impact that has on health and all other manner of things. So I saw Rick a few months ago, and it's like, well, when's that data coming out? And he says, we're not able to release it, and we just finished the ventilation guide. And we couldn't get any data on any of these projects. Commerzbank has been in operation for 15 years and they still won't release the data. And he said, you've got to appreciate that a portfolio like Bank of America, they've got 20,000 employees in maybe 5,000 buildings around the world. So the minute that you produce a report which shows that this building is performing better and it's a healthier environment, you open yourself up to legal claims from potentially 4,500 other employees that are housed in pretty crap offices around the world. And when he said that, it made me realize that there are things that are feeding into this that we perhaps don't appreciate. Shaking your head, David.
Yeah, I completely disagree.
You can measure energy.
We have a way of improving productivity of our staff. We pay them more money and they work harder. But I think you need to separate that out. And I think that when I was working with Arab and we were doing 2nd Avenue subway, the New York Transit decided to not put platform screen doors onto the platforms, despite it being cheaper and less operating costs and safer, because it would show that the rest of the system wasn't performing as well. Now, you've got to move forward, and we've got to get a dialogue going about, you know, it is extremely complicated. And for years, we'll get this data, and one consultant will say, oh, this means my building's the best. Another consultant says, this means my building's the best. But it's that dialogue that we need to know where we are. At the moment, it's like we're all telling it's like designing a car and saying it's really, really efficient, but actually not having any way of working out how many miles per gallon you've got. And then somebody saying, well, I'm not going to tell you because I've got some things that aren't very good. You know, we've just got to get
over it.
We've got to get companies like Bank of America to fulfill an obligation to society by telling us how much energy they're using, and then exploring that, and deciding as society whether or not we think it's nuts, or we'll just go down the tubes.
But we have a chance with Tishman Speyer, for instance, and the other portfolio managers that would do that pretty soon the bank has to realize they're part of a swimming pool of other people that are disclosing, and so it would get there. It's a threshold.
There's plenty in our kind of peer group of developers, you know, in the U.S., people that we talk to all the time, you know, and they're well-known names, and we're all moving in the same direction. I mean, that capability of measuring and understanding what your buildings are doing, it's critical to being a successful landlord these days. And it's increasingly part of the dialogue that we can have with tenants, because we can use that data to tell them, look, this is what you should be able to expect your utility bill is going to be. And we've done that through increasing the load on daylighting. We've decreased how your system is set up and how you can utilize it. You can make a difference too, but here's some things we've already done for you.
Sabah from Kuwait. One of our main problem is we see architects and developers always present their buildings as being really the best, but we don't get the feedback 15 years from building that. One example, for example, the World Trade Center in Bahrain. We had a presentation how good this will be and all of this. We know that did not work, but we did not get any feedback, and unfortunately we don't get any feedback once those buildings are finished and what really the developers and the architects and the engineers have said that those buildings are going to do, and they didn't do that. And it's essential that we get some feedback from the same people why this did not work.
Anthony, we were on the awards jury this year, and there was an award that we had some debate about regarding performance of buildings. So maybe it's an area that we can continue to talk about in terms of that there are awards related to performance over time. I think this year we kind of put the toe in the water, but I think our ability to, as a group, to continue that dialogue and seek out buildings that are performing and have the data to back it up begins to give some examples that we can maybe exploit.
And I think that Australia has the opportunity to show us and lead the way and show and have a discussion about what you're doing.
Hi, Mick Patterson with Enclosed. I've been hesitant to ask this question, but Richard, you opened the door with your comment on the global warming thing and stuff. So I'm going to take this opportunity because you guys are in the center of this dialogue about sustainability, and I'm really curious. I agree with virtually everything that you've been talking about. I think that this data collection thing is hugely important, and we have to figure out a way to make it happen. But beyond this, this whole question, the big picture of sustainability, and two of the fundamental precepts we know are durability and adaptability. of our buildings going forward. So Richard, you talked about, if the water levels rise 20 feet or whatever, we're still using the buildings, there's boats parked outside or whatever. And what obligation do we have to anticipate that kind of thing happening? Because, we're looking at we've lived through a couple of bubbles, the dot-com bubble, which I think in hindsight is going to be relatively minimal. Now we had the housing bubble. A couple big bubbles that we can see coming at us are water, for example, and that could be on us. Talk about property values going down. The Southwest United States, when you turn on the tap and no water comes out, that's going to really devastate property values. And then there's the the energy question, which is like, so we're talking about, and I think appropriately, you're talking about 100 years, 200 years. I really think that there is the potential for, and before too long, we will be talking about 1,000-year buildings. So when we start talking about those kind of time frames, what kind of obligation do we have to try and anticipate, what is going to happen in those time periods? And particularly with something, for example, like, energy, everything that goes on at the, so much of what goes on at the conference is technologically optimistic. Richard, you said, you are excited about what you think the future is going to yield with materials, new systems, new techniques for construction. David and Robert, the prefabrication modular stuff is all going to be great. There's a level of technological optimism about that. Energy is a fundamentally different thing. If the supply of energy is disrupted, temporarily or on a long-term basis, a lot of those technological options are just gone, and we really don't have any viable alternate solutions at this point in time. So I'm sorry for the long question, but I'm really curious, do you guys think about this? Do you talk about this? Do you think that this should be a more active part of our dialogue, and we should be trying to anticipate what the future 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years might bring upon us?
I think there's a short-term answer and a long-term answer to your question. And Mehdi has the short-term answer, having lived through a flood in Chicago that he'll talk about. But the long-term answer is I suspect you really can't guess. I mean, let's just take the Empire State Building. It's been around a long time. It is an icon. It's an icon to all of us, even though an icon just in New York. Its function as an office building is borderline, really. It's reinvented itself as a value because of the observation deck on the top. And I'm renovating a 70-story building I did in Houston 20 years ago with an observation deck right now. And the funds that flow from one of those things is changing that particular building. But I don't know if an energy standpoint, if we can do much about how we're building these buildings that allows us to think about what could happen in the future, but we would have to renovate them. But you should hear Mehdi's story about Chicago. It's quite a good one.
Well, I think just to finish what you were talking about is that the buildings that we all work on, we think about a period of life for them. You can only design to a certain limit. Obviously, economics and everything that goes with it is very important to consider today. But you need to build flexibility that building can be reposition itself, like you talked about the Empire State, and there's many other examples all over the world that are doing it. With regard to short process, I think you talked about flood in Chicago. We were talking earlier, actually, most of you have heard back in the 90s, there was a flood in Chicago underground. You didn't really see it above. There was a hole that was created in the tunnel. And most of the buildings had their basements completely full of water. And where do we put all the mechanical equipment and systems? They're all in the basement. And we had to actually scramble and try to take pieces of equipment from the entire city construction sites and bring it to one location to build a plant for board and trade in Chicago in 72 hours, design and build it next door so they can come up and running. So thinking about items like that, and if they had thought about it at the very early on, that was the heart of a financial system, they would have put all the equipment at the top of the building. They wouldn't put it somewhere that it would flood. So there's a short answer and a long answer to it, but there's also a limit to it. you know.
Yeah, I also think from a structural perspective, there isn't, you know, if you've got a building that's enclosed in skin, it's not, you know, it's going to last for 200 years. The wind loads will be little different. The probability of expecting its maximum seismic force will be little different, unless there is a fundamental change in weather patterns. And if there is a fundamental change in weather patterns, there's a much bigger problem. So I can't see provisions from a structural perspective changing what we're doing at the moment. And I'll have one of my colleagues disagree with me.
My question is quite, Hee-Sun Choi from Somton Tomaseti. I have a question very related to the topic we just discussed. But my question is that we haven't seen many pictures through this conference, 20 years ago, Shanghai versus now, 20 years ago in Dubai versus right now. City has been evolved a lot for the past 2 decades. I do believe that skyscraper as a vertical city, I think our building has to evolve as well. So right now, we're doing buildings, let's say we have a fixed residential, 20 office, 20 story of hotels, and then we've been asked as a structural engineer to optimize building system. So right now, the requirement for residential is quite different than offices and hotels. Are we gonna fix the city as it is? We're not talking about zoning changes in the future? Because that actually not only optimizations, but it is involved with the selection of structure system as well. Because sometimes we would ask, go with a post-tension, and I always resist on post-tension slab because it doesn't allow any single penetration through the slab. So I do believe that if our vertical city has to be sustainable over 100 years, we have to put it in some flexibilities in the city so that in the future, master plan could be changed. Our living culture, working environment always changes. So we should prepare for the future generation to reuse, recycle our buildings. So do you have any opinion on that?
I think that's a really great point. The repositioning of the buildings is really an important part of our industry. We think about new buildings. We all, being in this profession, we love to talk about new developments and drool over them, and they're nice and beautiful. But if you look at it worldwide, there are probably going to be maybe 1 or 2% of the buildings that are going to be built as new. The rest of the buildings are all existing there. What do we do with that stock? And that's where the energy is, that's where the consumption is, that's where the sustainability has a bigger impact. So if you have a view to accommodate something that can be adopted over life, simply, as you indicated, from occupancy to occupancy, you've created something that's sustainable for a long term without impacting the energy. So I think that's a great point, and that's something that we all need to think about. And I believe in the next 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to be repositioning buildings more so than hearing about new buildings. Even these big emerging cities. Dubai, for example, has grown, but I think in a couple years, they're going to start renovating. And it's a true thing. So.
I think it's interesting you mentioned post-tensioning. That is the thing that is limiting right now, especially as you see so many companies doing more and more open space planning and having to core drill through the renovation of existing buildings. They go out and look at a building and it looks pretty cheap because it's a B quality building, and nobody tells them it's a post-tension slab until the structural engineers and the architects get there and they say, how in the world am I going to do 50 core drills on a slab? And we struggle through that stuff right now, trying to renovate existing buildings. So in the future, it'd be even worse. You had a question, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Abdullah Abbas from Sudan. I'm an architect. Thank you for this nice 3 days. We hear a lot of topics about tall buildings, and I believe that there's a need for it in this area where we have 60 million habitat coming to the urban areas. But in our case, in Middle East and Africa, it will be very surprising to have a tall building of 300 or to reach 1 kilometer. Why? What is the reason? if we will spend $20 billion, we can create a complete city, nice city for people to live in, than to have a tower in a climate where it is difficult to be, and socially it is unaccepted to live in 1 kilometer height or 800 meter height. Now what is going on? Some rich people, they will take apartments there and they will be there for 7 days, every 6 months, something like that. So what is the benefit if among us a big consultant now? I believe that all of you is big consultants, big contractor, big developers. Why we are going to this trend? To which height we are going? Now we start from 50 meter, 100, 200, 300. We said, okay, we reach 800, 500, 800, and now we are going to 1 kilometer, and no one knows when we will finish and where we will finish. So what is the future of these tall buildings? This is my question after these 3 days, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
I think I don't disagree with the statements that you made, that the council, I believe, is about tall buildings, not just the super tallest building. We don't know where the next tallest building will be, or what it will be. So I think that most of the conversations that I've found very interesting at this conference, it's not about the buildings over 800 meters, it's about the things that we do on a day-to-day basis where we can make a difference. And that's why I think most of us are here.
Also, I think the issue of the social value is at the core of your question as well, and whether or not it's appropriate for where you are. And that's why the name of the council includes urban habitat. And I think that we've been overwhelmed by that wonderful array of fabulous buildings going on that it overwhelms our dialogue because they're so interesting and so many things have happened recently. But the last 3 days, if I've heard one thing, it's that we have to get back and get things into a balance where we're really dealing with this level of professionality at the core ideas of urbanism, because the tall buildings are yet just a set piece of that force of urbanism. And it's appropriate to consider them in Hong Kong because of land mass and available mass, things like that. It may be a really good idea for Los Angeles to stop the sprawl, but I think that all those places, each one is different, and yours is a particularly unique place. It probably has a lot of things to solve. I don't know if you went to the Mumbai conference or not, but that was the core of that dialogue as well. It started in Mumbai. John, you ready now?
Hi, I'm John Magnuson. The question that I have has to do, maybe this is philosophy, maybe it's economics, but it's more, these structures that we create, they're particularly, say, office buildings. They're tools of business. They're for a business goal. And the question is, what do the businesses really value in those tools? For instance, if there's two buildings and they're basically identical kinds of locations, but one has a LEED credential and the other doesn't. Okay, if they're the same rental price, I could see the tenant saying, yes, I'll take it. So the question becomes kind of elasticity of demand, that if there's a price differential for that LEED credential, how much are the tenants, the businesses, willing to pay for that? And so it's a question, I guess, about societal values and whether they're willing to pay. Certainly they'll give it lip service, but when it comes right down to it, do the tenants pay? Will they pay 10% more for a LEED building compared to another? And I don't know if there's any solid data, but it's a question, because if we don't figure out how to get the business community to value, eventually it doesn't succeed.
There is data on it, John. And again, people like CBRE and some of the other global brokerages have collected data on that. So there are things you can point to. I think what we've seen in the clientele we deal with, the price tag that's associated with LEED doesn't really come into the conversation. Either the people are committed as part of their ethos to behaving in a corporately sustainable way or not. So the attachment of a price tag to it, there's an expectation that they're going to go into a LEED facility anyways. The thing that we've seen in over time with our tenants, increasingly for them, it's about some of the points, again, Anthony made. It's about productivity. It's about workplace. It's about creating a great environment for the biggest expenditure that most companies have is on their people. So how can they make a great place for their people? And how can they do it in an efficient, sustainable way? Most corporate real estate guys, when they look to balance decision-making of why they're going into a facility, there's triple bottom lines, but there's slightly different triple bottom lines than the one we always talk about here. Efficiency and how many people they can get in that space is a big driver, but it's got to be a great work environment these days, or else they're not going to be interested in it. They want to make sure that satisfaction that their people have from being in the space, for daylight, for views, for air quality, amenities in the building. Those are the things that really drive, I think, the bigger users that we associate with.
I think it's also influenced by the transparency of understanding the building that you're in and whether or not it is sustainable. And I think people, particularly young people, want to do their bit for society. And when there is a transparency, then there will be a value attached to a well-performing building compared to a poor-performing building. And that's what will drive the industry to want to create and refurbish buildings that are high performance. And because the young people will be pushing the financial giants who will want to position themselves and have a portfolio which is 80% in that bracket, and then it moves. At the moment, we don't know what we're doing, and people just say mine's better than yours.
You know, you made a comment about young people, and I think that's a great comment because as we've dealt with certain tenants, the quote young people have said, why do we need a new building? Why can't we find an old building and do as little as possible to it? And that's where our office should be. Isn't that a more sustainable solution? That's hard to argue with.
Yeah.
But,
and we're also seeing those tenants that have knowledge of what really the benefits of the high performance or green building, however you wanted to call it, is for them. It's not necessarily on the energy side of it. We all think and talk about energy, power, and consumption, but if you really look at a couple percent improvement in productivity of the individual can offset the entire energy consumption of the facility. So a lot of tenants that understand those mechanics, I mean, they do come and ask about it. They look at buildings that are more sustainable, have better daylighting, better environment, so they can keep their people at their desk working rather than leaving and staying sick. So I think it's a holistic approach that we need to look at from a development standpoint rather than just on the energy side of it.
I think another aspect of that is that the density of cities has become all very attractive to those very same young people. And the Silicon Valley is literally reaching out into the suburbs north of San Francisco with buses, and everybody in San Francisco that lives there, that they drag all the way down to Silicon Valley to go to work, but everybody wants to live back in the city. And the city is on fire right now with a lot of development because of that power of those particular people who want to live in high density life, and that changes the game right there as well. Yes?
Nadine had a question too.
Carol Caldman, University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you for a great discussion, really very, very inspiring. But when I review my observations of the conference, when I walked in and I am walking out today, I feel that I really got to change my mind about tall building being sustainable. I talk about tall building as sustainable. I write about that. I argue, I advocate tall building as sustainable building typology because of talking about Ken Young's ecological design, embracing renewable energy techniques, technologies, for example, harnessing wind energy, harnessing solar energy. So we reach the zero energy or positive energy sustainable tall building. That's in theory, right? I come here to practice. I see very much a different picture. None of the buildings I've seen in the last 3 days embraced wind turbines or solar panels significantly, or ecological design, or so I feel there's a vivid dichotomy between theory and practice, between what we talk about and what we do. And we are right here at the age of the sustainable skyscraper city. So does sustainable skyscraper city, skyscraper belong to this age or to the second age? Or are we contradicting ourselves? We do the same way we do. You mentioned the glass issue. We still do all glass. I mean, like,
yeah, but
so what's
do.
the messages we get here? Like, really emphasizes a significant difference between what we are talking about, what we argue about, and what we do.
Yeah.
I'm going to start that in a second, and there's a few things. There are a number of buildings in that row right there that tried dealing with wind. I mean, Gordon Gill and Adrian did one with the wind turbines in it. They tried it in Masdar at the City Hall. There's a building in Houston with wind turbines all over the top of it right now, and the other buildings in town lease against it because they're telling everybody that the tenants that it could be vibrating. So the attempts have been made. Glass technology, by the way, is the most improved part of materiality that's happened in a long time. It's not your grandfather's glass. Let's start with that. So I think that's a very good thing that's happened. But you're right. I think the efforts of those of us in the council that are involved in these buildings have reached out and tried and come back from, can you put solar panels all over the building and make it make sense? Yes, in 40 years. You know, there's been all of that effort to try and then retrenching back again. And I think the discussion that we're having is more about the fact that the sustainability we're dealing with may come in the future again in other technologies and other materials. But right now, it's really more about the city than it is the individual object that we're saying is still a valid idea to evaluate these buildings as sustainable. Sorry, again, anybody else?
Well, I've got two things. First of all, I think people have tried wind turbines a lot. And I think the lack of the feedback is because they're not working. The wind doesn't hit the building, it flows over the building, and trying to grab it to generate energy is difficult. So, you know, we've tried, ARIP have tried it, lots of consultants have tried to figure out how to do that, and it works in some configurations and doesn't work in others. And getting the data is what we need to do. And the second point I'd like to say is Nadine Post has been sitting up at the back with her hand waving it around for the last 10 minutes. I've never seen her so quiet and reserved. But maybe you want to give her a chance.
Put your arm up, Nadine.
Hi, I'm Nadine Post with Engineering News Record magazine, and I just wanted to say that New York City has a new building energy auditing program. And I think buildings are required to do a baseline audit and then every 10 years in terms of energy consumption. So maybe other cities are starting to do things like that. And I don't know if they're going to release that data to the public or not, but there's that happening. And the other thing, I just wanted to say, make a statement, that sustainability in Dubai, or sustainable Dubai, it's an oxymoron. A place that desalinates almost all of its drinking water, that does not produce any of its food locally, that that is overdeveloping. I don't see how anyone with a straight face can call the Burj Khalifa a sustainable skyscraper because there's development at the base. And it's not a compact, livable city. It's a completely sprawling, unlivable city. So I think that I don't think we're in the age of the sustainable skyscraper city yet. Hopefully we will be, but it's not happening now, not from what I've observed over the last 35 years covering buildings around the world. It just isn't here yet.
You know, Nadine, I
Sorry.
Nadine,
Tried to keep quiet.
I think we all agree that there's much to do. Yeah, there's much to do. And this group of professionals, you know, I think there's probably many of us who've been doing this for a while. We realize every day how much more there is to do. I mean, we've scratched the surface on a lot of things. But within the length of our careers, it's going to go on far beyond us before we really get this right. So I think your points are pretty well noted, but everyone knows it, I think.
I think to also add to your comment about New York and what other cities have done, I don't know if you know about Chicago 14 that just started. It's actually a pilot program of 14 existing buildings that the owners and managers have elected to become part of the program, where the city funds part of the construction and repositioning and upgrades of this building, and then as a result of that, they've agreed to publish the information to the public and demonstrate what the benefits are. And then that pilot program can grow and other buildings can adopt to it and as a guideline, and sort of a self-growing type of advancement that's been initiated. So I think it's an important thing that big cities do this, and we need to do that across the world.
You can make similar comments about places like Houston, and I think that the history and development of cities is something that we can't control here, but what frustrates me a lot is that I don't think that the States is any better than Dubai in releasing data about how much energy that it's using for travel, for communication, for living, and I think that holistic problem is something that we as a community should be interested in, and we should be at least trying to get some of the data out.
Lester Partridge from AECOM again. Listen, first comment on the last two talks there, or the last two questions. I don't think buildings necessarily with PVs and wind turbines are necessarily sustainable buildings. I think if you look at the facts, if you actually look at the performance, the monitoring that we've done on buildings over the last 15 years through the Neighbours scheme, we've come a long way in improving performance of buildings. You can see the average performance of a building in Australia 10 to 15 years ago, it's around about 2.5 stars. They're 5.5 now. So the buildings that are being built are 5.5. So we've actually improved the performance by over 50% of building energy on the standard building. So, and that's done by things like improving the performance or the efficiency of the air conditioning system, the lights, the zoning of the air conditioning. They're all really boring things. They don't win prizes or anything else, but that's where we're starting to make big inroads. So, I think we are on the road, we're going the right way, but it's a law of diminishing returns. We're not going to get to a carbon neutral building. Buildings by definition are energy users. As soon as you start going up a few floors, you need an elevator. As soon as you start enclosing the facade, you need a fan to put air in. As soon as you get deep plan, you need lights to light the place up. So it's maybe the way we want to look at is building buildings which reduce the minimum amount of energy, but maybe looking at precinct-style systems where we're starting getting clean energy into a precinct, which has been generated elsewhere, which then means we've got a clean precinct as opposed to a clean building. your comments, please.
I totally agree with what you're indicating. I think that a lot of buildings have done a significant improvement over years, not only from design standpoint for new technologies. I think building envelope design has significantly improved for the last 15, 20 years. A lot of new advancement there. And also the existing buildings have done significant improvement on what they did. I've been involved with the Sears Tower, Willis Tower in Chicago for about 25 years now. What they have done since they opened the building to today, they have reduced their energy consumption by over 55%. And that's without changing the envelope. It's all internal, and it hasn't really changed its occupancy. It still has the same occupancy. Things have improved, lighting has improved. I think big buildings have a big impact on the overall energy, and they're doing a lot of these. So I think I totally agree with what you're talking about, not only within the building from wind and solar power, but you can buy that power from somewhere else where it's generated very effectively, very efficiently, and produced and delivered to you, rather than putting it on your building. So totally agree with that. Yes.
Hi, Terry Boak, architecture professor, University of Waterloo. I think one of the big elephants in the room that nobody talks about, and reflecting on the book that I still have to buy on natural ventilation, is natural ventilation. And the discussion about all the observation decks that are being put on tops of buildings as income generators. I've been up the Burj, and I can't see very far. Sometimes you can see to the ground. Do you want to open the windows when they're full of sand, when they're full of particulates? My first visit to China was into Chongqing. Flew in, never been to China before, and I was on a bus tour, and they were telling me about the beautiful mountains and the beautiful city, and I couldn't see across the street. And so I think that if we're going to talk about sustainable buildings and urban habitat, that we have to clean up the air, because unless we clean up the air, there's no point in natural ventilation, and we can't open the windows. And the durability of buildings is going to suffer. I mean, buildings in Chongqing that were 5 years old looks like they were 50 years old, just because of the grime that was actually eating into the cladding. And I think that we have to look really holistically at buildings in the urban environment so that we have places that people want to live and can open their windows. Because, I mean, we don't need to add PV, and we don't need to add wind turbines and pay for all the gadgets that make them look like sustainable buildings. We need to go for the low-hanging fruit, and that would be, you know, it's a nice spring day, open the window. I mean, all the hotels are all sealed glass, and that frustrates me. I want a hammer. I just want to open up the window some night and you know, listen to the noises on the street as opposed to the drone of the air conditioning. And I think that we need to begin to design our buildings in a very more human way. And in order to do that, we need to have an environment that we want to invite into our interiors.
Sustainability embraces so many things, and social sustainability, I think people are beginning to understand that now. You know, I mentioned this earlier in the week. I'm really interested in cultural sustainability, you know, in a sense that this issue of cities becoming homogenized. Shanghai looking like Dubai, looking like every other city that ends in I, you know, and I wonder, when I talk about that, people kind of nod and sympathize, but I mean, I'd like to hear from the panel, quite honestly, do you share that concern or not? Do you think we need to be striving for buildings and cities that are unique to their geographic location, to their environmental location, or should we just give up and acknowledge that that's just, you know, the way the world is going? It's becoming homogenized, whether it's language or food or Starbucks or, you know, should we just give up on that and let built cities all become, you know, built up of the same kind of architecture and icons?
I don't think you can ever give up on that. It's what makes the world an interesting, lively place and makes us want to travel around and see what's there. I think a lot of it relates to the bones, though. And Rick talked a little bit about the DNA of cities and how they're put together. I think when you've spent time in a variety of cities and lived and worked in them, you find out the rules of why a city is what it is. There's usually pretty good reasons and for the older cities being the way they are. I worry about the newer cities, Anthony. I think I worry about a place like Dubai. Is it referential to itself in a way that really makes sense? But if you compare the reasons why London looks like, why does London look like London? Why does Paris look like Paris? Why is New York looking the way it does? And if you take parts of Shanghai and you realize there's a reason why that looks that way, but then why does Pudong look the way Pudong does? You know, there's some typologies of how cities are put together. We should embrace those differences and fight to retain them. So I say no, we can never give up on that. We've really got to strive to retain the differences that exist in the world. That's what makes it such a fascinating place.
I think I would agree that this is a dialogue answer, not a one-person answer, just to keep the dialogue floating, because I think that's the purpose of your question as well. The plans of the various cities that Bob just mentioned are uniquely different, the block plans of New York and Shanghai and everything else. And that's generated the feel of the community actually more than the look of the buildings. And I would say that we're still struggling to try to find a regionality in a very tall building. I'm not sure it's ever been done in a way that I think will last in a long-term basis visually. You could probably make the case that, again, all this row of buildings over here are look the way they do because of the technology that drives them, rather than the pastiche of a look invented by some architect thinking it would be really cool because it's in a certain place. And we're struggling with that issue. I'm not sure it couldn't happen at some point in time. Petronas probably got the closest of all those. But it's an interesting architectural dialogue to have, and at some point in time you just give up. All airplanes look the same because they're made like to go through the air. But when they reach the ground, the other thing I've noticed, speaking of the ground thing, is there's always these odd, large chunks of stuff that is attaching itself to the building across the street, and even this building, which is the building we're sitting in, that seem to deny the whole beauty of this big, tall tower and how it really works at the lower levels. It's a very strange piece of the architecture that seems to reoccur from one building to the other. But nevertheless, I think the whole thing about the reality of how the city itself is defined is what's going to get the differences from these buildings, rather than just gluing on some history.
If you consider the speed of construction of a city like Shanghai, it's amazing that there is so much variety within it. So I think that places like London and Paris evolved over several hundred years and have got a certain richness that came from that slow development. New York was probably 100 years, and Shanghai has been 20. So I think it's just important to celebrate the differences and assume that you don't, I've seen people criticize buildings simply because they've never seen anything like it before, and that looks crazy. But having designed a few crazy buildings myself, you can actually get a lot of efficiency out of complex shapes. But you can't have a city of complex shapes because it just looks crazy. So it's got to be a mixture of differences, and you need to have the architecture, in my view, that is going to give you the differences.
To follow on that, I know that I just got the exclamation point and we're answering your question, so I guess we can go on for a second. Sears Tower, Willis Tower, might be one of the best of the regional buildings. It's hard to imagine that building that has no frou-frou on it whatsoever trying to become a regional building. Try to imagine it in any other city besides Chicago. Black, tough. That hit it. I think, in a certain kind of way. Bank of America, Pietro Beluschi wanted to have towering granite peaks to the high Sierras. San Francisco Bank of America. Got a little closer. Exactly. Well, thank you all very much for the time, and we appreciate your patience in putting up with all of our opinions, and I'm sure everybody will be ready to have further conversations if you have the time afterwards, but it's been a great conference. Thank you very much, Anthony, for putting this on. I think we've all had a good time together, so thank you very much. Thank you.